All right, we welcome you all to this seminar. A good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're listening in from. Today, we are excited to hear from Alam on some of his studies. To start this seminar, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. Iowa State University aspires to be the best land grant university at creating a welcoming and inclusive environment where diverse individuals can succeed and thrive. As a land grant institution, we are committed to the caretaking of this land and would like to begin this event by acknowledging those who have previously taken care of the land on which we gather. Before this site became Iowa State University, it was the ancestral lands and territory of the Bakoje or Iowa Nation. The United States obtained this land from the Meskwaki and Sauk nations in the Treaty of 1842. We wish to recognize our obligations to this land and to the people who took care of it, as well as to the 17,000 native people who live in Iowa today. I would like to take the pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Alam Ramirez. Alam is a first-generation student that received his bachelor's degree in agronomy from Iowa State. He's currently pursuing a master's in soil science with Dr. Horton. His soil interests are understanding the soil-water balance and the energy balance in soil to better understand how to manage the soil. At this juncture, I would like to welcome Alam to speak to us.
Thank you, Francis, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here and listening to my talk. I'm going to share some of the work I did for my master's thesis with you. Here you can see a nice picture of a tractor, and it's important that we keep studying compaction because the trend with tractors is that they keep getting bigger and bigger. And what we're going to look at is how these bigger and bigger tractors can potentially affect soil at different landscape positions. So to start off with, I want to explain what soil compaction is. So if you look at this picture on the left, you can see what is an ideal soil. So it consists of 50% solid, 25% airspace, and 25% water space. What happens when you compact soil is that you're increasing the bulk density and decreasing your porosity at the same time. So in this figure, the picture on the right, you can see how there's more solids in that same volume and that there's that clear reduction in porosity. So what that reduction in porosity can cause is you're going to see a decrease in the soil's ability to hold water, and you're going to see it's harder for fluids to move through the soil. Compaction is a really common effect that humans have on the natural environment. Just about everything we do causes compaction to some extent. If we go camping, that causes compaction. And typically, as agronomists, we think of it as a negative. That's not always the case. In some situations, compaction is desirable. So if we're constructing a roadbed, we want that soil to be a solid subsurface so that our roads last a really long time. But in agriculture, soil compaction is typically viewed as undesirable because it has the potential to limit yield. So if we look up at this picture, I'll go into more detail on what these treatments are. But if you look at the control and the planter, the ones on both sides, we can see that those are in a later stage of plant development. And these are the ones that received the least amount of compaction. And these rows down the middle received more compaction. And we can see that it's in a earlier stage of plant growth. And the reason that soil compaction limits plant growth sometimes is it can makes it harder for the roots to enter the soil, and it can limit nutrient and water uptake. So now I want to talk about why we're interested in different landscape positions. So soil forming factors cause different soil properties at different landscape positions. So if we look at the summit, the top of our landscape, I like to think of these as areas of loss. Predominantly during rain events, what happens is that soil particles are washed down the landscape, and a preferential sorting effect takes place. The finer and the smaller these soil particles are, the further down the landscape they are moved. And on the steepest part, the back slope, I think of that as an area of transport. So what's happening is there's a little bit of the deposition going on, but really it's just a lot of soil particles are moving down. And when we get to our low landscape positions, our toe slopes, our foot slopes, our depressions, that's where an area of accumulation happens. And that's where these fine soil particles are deposited. And it sounds like I'm talking about erosion, but we're not going to be discussing erosion in this talk. What I want to emphasize is that these processes create different soil conditions at different landscape positions. And when we think about these processes occurring, we typically think about them happening on pretty drastic landscapes. But these processes have been observed in landscapes really very similar to ours, and they've been observed in landscapes with differences in elevation as small as 2 meters. And another reason why we wanted to look at landscape positions, their compaction has been very intensively studied for decades at this point. But typically they're looking at different fields and completely different soil types. There aren't many studies that look at the effect of wheel traffic on a single landscape at different landscape positions. That's where there's kind of a lack of studies. So the big question that we wanted to get some insight on is, how does soil respond to wheel traffic at different landscape positions? And since soil compaction has been extensively studied, we can come up with pretty reasonable hypotheses for what we would expect to see. We would expect the bulk density to increase as wheel traffic increases. Just the more compression, the more solid that's going to be in that same volume. We would expect other things that involve flow and water retention to decrease. So in this case, we expect the saturated hydraulic conductivity, the air permeability, the water retention, and our macro pore volume to decrease as wheel traffic increases. We also suspect that because of these landscape positions having different soil properties, we would expect each landscape position to have a different response to wheel traffic. So if we go through our treatment descriptions here, I'm going to describe the treatments that I applied. Can you see? Yep, you can see my cursor. Okay, so this figure shows the treatments as they were laid out in the field. Here we can see the control treatment. There was no wheel traffic applied to this. Our next biggest wheel traffic was in the planar mainframe, and this was all the way on the right. Our next largest wheel compaction treatment was the grain cart, and this was a loaded grain cart, a fully loaded grain cart. The compaction here, where the wheel traffic here was pretty heavy. We had approximately 28 megagrams. And then our heaviest was the grain cart plus the planar mainframe. This was the heaviest wheel traffic. I want to point out here that, we weren't able to put the planter on top of the grain cart. So what happened here, you can see it in this figure in row 11, what happened first, the planar mainframe went over, and immediately followed by that, we had the loaded grain cart. So these things it's one after the other, they didn't happen together. So the maximum wheel traffic, the heaviest wheel traffic that those two treatments received was the same. So for experiment description, the 3 landscape positions we looked at was the summit, the back slope, and the toe slope. We replicated each landscape position 3 times for a total of 9 plots, and from each plot we took 12 samples. And the soil type in the toe slope was a fine loamy, poorly drained Nicolette loam. And the back slope and the summit were the same soil type. They were a fine loamy, well-draining clarion loam. And these were the results that we got from Web Soil Survey. We wanted to verify these results, so we submitted soil samples from each plot for particle size analysis. And when we got the results, they changed what we saw. The summit was predominantly a loam. The back slope was predominantly a silty clay loam, and that toe slope was predominantly a clay loam. So we do see that trend that we would expect from our soil forming factors, that soil's becoming finer as we move down the landscape. We applied our compaction treatments after a rain event. So you can see that the toe slope was the wettest landscape position, and it dried out as we moved up the landscape. And these water contents are high enough that I suspect that these were good conditions to cause some compaction to occur. So moving on to our sample collections, I really want to emphasize our sample collection because I think it might be of interest to other soil scientists. So all our samples we got from the A horizon. We used the Giddings hydraulic probe with a custom soil sampler, and we used plastic liners. One thing, I'm used to using metal rings, and one thing I really appreciated from the plastic liners is that it's really easy to see when you got a good soil sample. A lot of the times with the plastic liners, I find that you hit a rock or something happens and there's voids or something like that. It's really easy to prevent that and get good samples with the plastic liners. I know a lot of people like the plastic liners, especially soil scientists in pedology, because they're easy to cut open and look at the entire soil core. However, for some soil physical measurements that we wanted to do, these plastic liners were not suitable. These plastic liners were really flexible, and what ended up happening is, if we look at this picture on the bottom left, if we see all across this edge, I'm not sure how well you can see it, so I'll just tell you there's lots of cracks along that edge. So what can happen with those cracks when we measure things like air permeability, saturated hydraulic conductivity, anything that involves a fluid, flow of a fluid through soil, that fluid can flow along that wall of our plastic liner. And because it's flexible, it moves around a lot and left some voids. So we came up with this subsampling procedure to be able to use metal rings. So because these were flexible and we wanted to maintain as much as the soil structure as we could, we had to figure out how to keep them immobile while we cut them at the desired lengths. So we did that, we used expanding foam. So do you know that insulation that you use on your windows, that it's in a can and it expands? So that's what we ended up using. If you can see it in this picture on the top right, the reason that soil core looks funny is because it's completely surrounded by that foam. So in this picture on the bottom left, all around, you can see that yellow, all of that is expanding foam. And this foam did a really good job at keeping the soil in place and not moving, but it also didn't enter into the soil pore network. So here we just used the chop saw to cut it to the desired length, and then we used a vise to insert a metal ring. We used the vise because it let us apply a constant and steady pressure and also insert that metal ring straight. When we tried doing it by hand, getting it in straight was really difficult, so we ended up using a vise. One thing that the chop saw was causing, you see in that picture again on the bottom left, a really, really smeared surface. So if we did measurements with a surface that smeared, I don't think that would be a very realistic result. And I think that would influence results. So what we did, we roughened that really smeared surface. In that picture on the bottom right, you can see the pattern we cut into our soil sample, and then we try to slice off a really, really thin portion just to get rid of all that smearing. Moving on to the measurements we did do, we measured the air permeability, the saturated hydraulic conductivity, the bulk density, and the water retention curve. We used measurements from the water retention curve to calculate our macro pore volume. So for bulk density, I think all of us are pretty familiar with it. We just dried out our samples at 105 degrees until they reached the constant weight. And we knew the width and the height of our rings. For saturated hydraulic conductivity, we used the constant head method. And on that picture on the left, you can see there's water ponded above a saturated soil core. We can calculate the saturated hydraulic conductivity based on how much water drains out. We got a good amount of compaction in some of our soil samples that we couldn't get any water to move through that soil core with just another soil ring on top of it. So we use this device on the right. It's called the Permeometer, and it still uses the same constant head method. It just allows us to apply a much bigger head. With the Permeometer, we could go up to the equivalent of 500 centimeters of head. And it's just practical. I don't have a 5 meter ring, so a 5 meter long soil ring. So that's why we use the Permeometer. To measure air permeability, we use this gasometer. We drained our soil samples to a pressure of 100 centimeters of water, about 1/10 of a bar. And we put them in this gasometer. And here in the gasometer, this end of the soil core is open, and we push air through it. And the only way air can exit the system is through the top of the soil core. And based on how much air moves through, we can calculate air permeability. Our water retention curves, we use the water desorption method. We applied a pressure and water drained at each pressure we applied. And we use this information to calculate our water retention curve. From the water retention curve, we're also able to calculate the macro pore volume. We can use this simple equation, and we define macro pores as the pores that would not hold water when we applied 1/10 of a bar. That's about 30 pores that are 30 microns and bigger. So moving on to our results, we're going to start from the worst results, moving to our better results. So here, if we look at our results for air permeability, only our landscape positions had a significant effect. So if we look at our air permeability, what we would expect to see is that the toe slope has the smallest air permeability because it's the finest soil, and it has because it's the finest soil would typically have the smallest porosity, and that's what we see. In general, as you move up the landscape, it does do that, but we see that the toe slope and the summit are grouped together, and the back slope is the biggest one. One thing I really want to point out, we have really big error bars. So we had a similar thing when we look at how the compaction treatments influenced the air permeability. Here with compaction treatments, we'd expect air permeability to decrease with wheel traffic just as more of that soil porosity gets crushed. We can see that trend here, but once again, we have these really big error bars. We can see the trend, but they're not significant just because we have these very big error bars in our data. So saturated hydraulic conductivity, it's a similar results. The landscape position is significant, but the compaction treatments aren't. So here with saturated hydraulic conductivity, what we would expect to see is that the summit has the biggest hydraulic conductivity because it would have the largest porosity because it's the most coarse soil on our landscape. And it does follow that trend. We see that the toe slope is completely different than the summit, and the back slope is in the middle of those two. This is the trend we want to see and the trend that is expected. Same thing with saturated hydraulic conductivity. We can see the appropriate trend as wheel traffic increases and that soil porosity is crushed. We see that saturated hydraulic conductivity is decreasing, but once again, that we have big error bars. The variability in these are big. We have lots of outliers. So these results aren't significant because of that. Air permeability and saturated hydraulic conductivity can do in general have large error bars because there's lots of small things that can have a big influence on air permeability and saturated hydraulic conductivity. So a worm channel, a pebble in the middle of that soil core that we don't know is there, a little bit of wall flow, just the pores are a little bit more connected. All those things can cause lots of variability. So that's why we think that's why we see these big error bars that are causing these treatments, even though they're following the trend we'd expect. We think that's what's causing these results to not be significant. So here we move on to our better results. Bulk density, we can see that the landscape position and the compaction treatments both were highly significant. So bulk density, we would expect to increase as we move up the landscape. And here is that we're seeing that trend, and each of these are separate from one another. These results are highly significant. So here we see our bulk density and how they're impacted by compaction treatments. And we see the general trend we want to see. As wheel traffic increases, we would expect that bulk density to go up just because there's more of those solids in that same volume. But here we can start to see something interesting. We can start to see that the control and the planar mainframe treatments can be grouped together, and that the grain cart and the grain cart plus planar mainframe can be grouped together. It makes sense to me. These two, the planar mainframe didn't receive a lot of compaction, so it makes sense that it can be grouped together with the control. And we can see that the grain cart and the grain cart plus planar mainframe, the heaviest wheel traffic on both of those was the same. So it makes sense that we can group both of these together. For our results, we can see for the results of our macro pore volume, we can see the same thing. Our landscape positions and our compaction treatments, both highly significant. So here we'd expect the toe slope to have the least amount of soil macropores because it's the finest soil texture, and the porosity there would be smaller. So this is good. It's what we expect, and it increases as we move up the landscape. Here we can see that the back slope and the summit can be grouped together, but the toe slope and the summit are different from one another. And this is what we would expect to see. In the macro pore volume and how it changes with the compaction treatments, once again, we see the trend that we want to see as wheel traffic goes and crushes those macro pores. We expect them to decrease because macro pores are the most readily crushed, the most sensitive to wheel traffic. So these will be crushed first before any of the micropores or any of the mesopores. So as wheel traffic increases, we expect them to decrease as well. And that's the general trend we see. Here we can see that the control and the planar mainframe are once again grouped together. And the grain cart and the grain cart plus the planar mainframe, we can group those two together. And if you remember all the way back to the beginning of this presentation, I think it pretty closely follows what we're seeing in the field too. If you remember the control and the planar mainframe, those plant growth didn't really seem limited. But if we looked at the grain cart treatments and the grain cart plus planter mainframe treatments, we could see that there was a clear reduction in plant growth. So moving on to our water retention curve. Ideally, in an ideal water retention curve, what we want to see is these long kind of sweeping lines. And if we pay attention to our axis, these are really only the really wet part of the water retention curves. The units I have here are from 0 to 500 centimeters of water, and these are the absolute values. So the matrix potential here is really negative 500 centimeters and negative 400. But here, just for make the graph easier to look at and understand, these are the absolute values. And in terms of bars, this is only from about 0 bars to about half a bar. So here, this blue line is the control. And we can see that as we increase the pressure, there's a lot more water draining from that. And that's what we want to see once we get to field capacity, about 1/3 bar. Here, we can see that a lot more water has drained from there and is allowing a lot more air to enter. So in conclusion, what we have was that the bulk density and the macro pore volume were our best indicators of compaction. They were good at quantifying how much compaction occurred, and we got the same results for our bulk density and our macro pore volumes. Both of them grouped the control and planner mainframe treatments together, and they grained both grain cart treatments together. And air permeability and saturated hydraulic conductivity showed the trends that we would expect to see. However, because of their high variability, we can't say that those results were statistically significant. And then the last thing that we concluded was that landscape position plays a big role in how soil responds to traffic. We saw that different landscape positions responded differently to the compaction treatments. And in every one of our measurements, the landscape position was always statistically significant. So the practical application of this is that we see that because different landscapes respond differently, we should be managing different landscapes differently. I think this is something that farmers already know, and they're already doing. That I think they know to not go out in a field when it's too wet, and try to be careful on those finer soil textures. And here we can see what I was talking about, that the control and the planner treatments don't seem to be too impacted by the compaction they did receive, and that the 2 grain cart treatments were the most severe. And I would have really liked to have been able to give you complete yield data, but the year we did this was the year we had the derecho. So as much as I would like to, I can't give you that data. All I can show you is the early plant growth that we got. So I want to thank our collaborators. We worked with Dr. Dar's group. In particular, Katie Taylor was very helpful. And I want to thank my major professor, Dr. Horton, for all his help and all his guidance on this project. And John Deere and the National Science Foundation provided financial support for this project.
We've got one question online from Dr. Cruz already. Did you measure tire pressure on the planter and grain cart? You might need to, well, I guess they can see it in the chat of the audience.
Dr. Cruz, yes, we did. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure what those numbers are, but I have them in a big table in my notes. I don't know what they are off the top of my head.
When you try to publish this, well, first of all, really nice job, very nice presentation. When you try to publish this, especially for making measurements close to the soil surface, your pressure is probably going to tell you a bigger story when you try to relate to other research that's being done than the axle loads that associated with the grain cart or the planter weight. Deeper depths, yeah, the total weight is more important, but in the surface layer, I think you want to know the tire pressures.
Okay.
Got a question
Yeah.
along. I usually let other people ask before I did, but I want to echo Dr. Cruz. You did a great job. You want to speculate a little more about why landscape position was so strong of an effect relative to, and you intentionally, it looked like you intentionally tried to compact it. You did it after a rain, did everything right, but many of the measurements did not show a compaction effect, even on your most compacted treatment. Do you have any speculation why that might be?
I think a lot of it has to do with the different water contents that were at each landscape position. We know that it's easier to compact soil as it gets wetter. So I think that just those different water contents at each landscape position are what's causing a big role. I also think that there's a little bit different of organic matter. It's not something that we measured, but just from working with the samples, I can tell there's a different color. And the trend seemed to be that as in the lower landscape positions, the organic matter is higher. So I think that also plays a role into how soil is responding. So Luis's question was, did we measure the texture? And we did measure the textures. The summit was predominantly a loam, and then the back slope was predominantly a silty clay loam, and the toe slope was predominantly a clay loam.
This is Michael Thompson. Can you, I'd like to ask a question too. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, Dr. Thompson.
Okay, great. Yeah, this is really interesting. I also want to ask a question about a couple of questions about the texture. I think you said that the finer soil was in the toe slope position,
Yes,
and that was the clay loam,
yes,
and the back slope position was a silty clay loam.
yes.
To me, when I think of clay loam and silty clay loam, I would think the clay loam would be the coarser because it would have more sand than a silty clay loam. So I wonder, what were the clay contents of those samples?
I don't remember what the breakdown of each was. I just remember that they were increasing with clay as we moved down the landscape, but I can't give you specific numbers off the top of my head.
Okay, but a related question then is, did you measure the texture in each of your cores? Or did you just collect one sample for your textural analysis and use one sample to represent each of the landscape positions?
So we didn't measure every core that we did. To do that would have been fairly expensive. We had 16 samples from each plot and a total of 9 plots. So what we did is we took one sample from each plot. So we took 3 samples from each landscape position, and we sent those off for particle size analysis. So we sent a total of 9.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Are there any specific reason why you choose the pressures why you didn't be like higher voltage?
So the question was, why did we pick the pressures we picked for the water retention curve, and why didn't we go all the way down to 15 bars? And the reason that we didn't was, this was in collaboration with John Deere, and what we were mainly interested in was that wetter part of the water retention curve from a previous study. The drier part of the water retention curve wasn't as affected. I think that that's because that part of the water retention curve is predominantly related to those smaller soil pores, and I think those are just more resistant to wheel traffic.
Yeah, question. Did you do most of these tests in your lab or in the lab? You said you sent the samples out for particle size analysis, but the rest of these tests you did in your lab.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So the question was, what did we measure, and what did we measure, and what did we send out for analysis? All the measurements I measured except for particle size analysis. The particle size analysis was done by Dr. Miller's group. Thank you.
Good, thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
If I remember correctly, at the time of compaction, the lower part of the soil hill slope was the wettest.
Yes, that's correct.
If I relate that to your bulk density measurements, it seemed like your bulk densities were highest on the top part of that slope. Did I get that right?
Yes. So
Okay, so what is the connection between water content and bulk density associated with those loads? It seems to be counterintuitive based on what you said.
So yes, we would expect that as water, if water content was the only factor, we would expect those to the bulk density to increase as the water content did. But I think that the other factor here was soil texture. So what I think was happening is that in the toe slope at these finer soil textures, there was just a higher soil strength, and that allowed it to be a little bit more resistant to the compression from the wheel traffic.
Thank you.
You use the terms error bars and variability. Just clarify what you mean by the whiskers on those.
Yes.
Well, maybe you can. The heart of my question is: are you describing things that are actually error, or just like the variability of observations?
Okay, so the question was asking me about the variability, and yeah, these were just variability and measurements. Their standard deviations were large in the air permeability and saturated hydraulic conductivity measurements.
Okay, let's thank Kalam.